In the first video on Monet, we saw one of the ways in which Monet's art acts as a gateway, the way in which he looks to the past as a romantic, distilling the eternal through his idealist faith in the beauty of light, and through his intuitive use of a bold palette, echoing the romantic painter's emotive use of colour and sublime effects of light. There's also a romantic element in Monet's decision to paint nature. As one critic wrote in 1867, the theory of landscape and politics is the same and can be summed up in a single word: freedom. However, on the other hand, we saw how Monet anticipates modernism, its experiment in brushwork and technique, weakening the emphasis on the literal and figurative and unifying the canvas in the artist's inner vision. The period 1879 to 1889 was a decade of change, both for Monet and the Impressionist group as a whole. In Monet's personal life, it can be mapped firstly as a series of events and places: his wife's death in Vetheuil in 1879, an event which Monet felt compelled to exorcise through painting. Moving to Poissy with Alice Ochedé in 1881, but working extensively on the Normandy coast, and moving in 1883 to Giverny, the place he would live until his death. And secondly, with the crisis of fragmentation in the Impressionist group and the challenge by the more radical Pointillists, how Monet's work reacted by adapting new techniques on the one hand, but at the same time returning to the romantic ideal of the picturesque. But also, beginning in this period, was a phenomenon which seems to be quite innocuous simply because it was so influential and became a commonplace, used by artists such as Cézanne from around 1885 onwards, with his paintings of L'Estaque and Mont Saint-Victoire. But whereas for Cézanne these were varying viewpoints and reinterpretations of a motif, what characterizes Monet's series is his unwavering focus on one object over time, often from the exact same position, an extension of the view through time. When in Bordighera in 1883, Monet had started to paint repeated works of the same view, and Monet developed a method of working on up to a dozen canvases simultaneously, turning to each at the appropriate time of day, trying to capture the subject as the envelope of light changed. Also in 1885, Monet returned to a subject he had first painted in 1864, travelling back to the Normandy coast to paint 8 views of the Porte d'Aval in Étretat, 3 from the same viewpoint, observing the changes in light effects on the rock and the expanse of air over the sea throughout the day. He would return to the motif the following year. But when in 1886 Monet travelled to the island of Belle-Île-en-Mer, where he executed 40 paintings in total, he chose to exhibit 8 of them together as an intentional series, showing various conditions of light and air extended over time. It's been remarked that works such as Storm at Belle-Île were a deliberate response to Pointillism, which is inherently unable to capture movement. In fact, this is a move to transcend painting itself, to transcend its capture of a moment, to instead create a moving image. In 1888, Monet returned to a subject he had painted in 1884, soon after moving to Giverny, the haystacks, this time producing 3 paintings from an identical viewpoint. The same viewpoint would produce a further 6 works the following year, and a further 19 canvases of variations of this view were produced over the next 2 years. The Haystack series is one of Monet's most famous, and rightly so, as the contrasting effects of light allow Monet to showcase his techniques of using his palette to render the optical impression of the colours of various different atmospheric conditions of light. In essence, the subject of the series, extended through time and in different light, becomes the light and shadow themselves, and hence Monet has succeeded in his given aim in painting, of painting the beauty of the air. In 1888, Monet travelled again to the south coast, this time to Antibes, following in the footsteps of his mentor Eugène Boudin. It's possible also that Monet's thoughts wandered back to Frédéric Bazille, his friend from his days as a student in Paris, who had been killed in the Franco-Prussian War. Bazille was from Montpellier to the west, and had painted the fortifications at Aigues-Mortes on the south coast as early as 1867. Monet's first works in Antibes were of the old fort of Antibes, viewed from the west in the changing southern light. In the year following his 1888 trip to Antibes, Monet travelled to the Creuse Valley, home of Gustave Geffroy, whom Monet had met in Belle-Île, and who would become Monet's biographer. Monet painted a series of canvases of the valley throughout the early spring. It's a testament to Monet's exacting standards that he employed a team of workmen with ladders to remove the excess foliage from a tree in the valley later in the year so he could continue working on his canvases. In 1891, Monet painted a series of poplar trees on the river Epte, a tributary of the Seine near his home in Giverny. Compositionally, Monet has used the newly imported Japanese narrow vertical format, and typical to ukiyo-e prints, the subject is cut off by the frame of the painting and employs strong, dramatic diagonals across the frame. 1892 and 1893 saw Monet's stays in Rouen to paint another of his most famous series, the facade of Rouen Cathedral, completing 11 canvases focusing exclusively on the portal on each trip, working from a space rented in a shop across the square. These canvases are from the first trip and document Monet's way of working on a particular canvas in specific weather conditions or at a particular time of a sunny day, and hence the effect of extending the subject over time can be seen as one progresses through the series. The sun moves down and across to behind the left shoulder of the viewer directly in the west, and lilac shadows rise up across the facade as the lowering sun reddens and sets, leaving the cathedral in a wash of the sun's light reflected purely from clouds above the horizon. By 1893, Monet had expanded his land at Giverny by purchasing land on the other side of the railway line that ran in front of his house. And it was here that Monet set about diverting a tributary to create his lily pond. This part of his garden provided the subject matter for a huge number of paintings from this time until Monet's death in 1926. This series included the Japanese-style bridge that he had built across the end of the pond. Following a device developed when painting ice flows on the Seine, Monet created space in the pond's surface with contrasting horizontal lilies and distant reflected verticals. Between 1900 and 1905, Monet revisited the smoke and fog of London that had been his refuge in the Franco-Prussian War, this time staying at the Savoy, painting several views from his hotel window. Over the space of 5 years, he painted many motifs of Charing Cross Bridge, and notably revisiting a subject he had painted back in 1871, the Houses of Parliament, this time using the building as a vehicle for a series observing the effects of light on London's atmosphere, reducing Parliament to a backlit silhouette, with the sky and the water in a dynamic relationship, capturing the changing position of the sun, the different effects of wind and light on the water, and transient clouds, sometimes absent, sometimes present, but above all emphasizing with a palette the changing colors of each. Monet's painting activity is incredibly well documented, owing to his frequent letters to Alice Ochedé while he was away on his trips, frequently complaining of his despair at changing weather conditions and his failure to complete canvases as a result, or his failure to capture particularly difficult effects. Ironically, since Alice travelled with Monet to Venice on his 1908 trip, we have less documentation than usual, other than Alice's letters, which reference Monet's painting activities in the day. As with most of his series, Monet has attempted to capture the subject through time, but with Venice, Monet has made the city itself the subject by painting from varying positions throughout the same day, painting for sessions of approximately 2 hours starting with the Palazzo di Doge from a gondola, or perhaps the Santa Maria della Salute, and also from the Isola di San Giorgio Maggiore, with the morning sun behind him, then moving across the Grand Canal to the Doge Palace to paint the Isola di San Giorgio Maggiore in the afternoon and evening, with the sun making a crimson and purple silhouette of the island and Palladio's church, with Santa Maria della Salute just discernible on the right of the canvas in crimson, and Monet pushing his chromaticism to its extreme, with the near side of waves reflecting cobalt violet sky behind us, and the sky descending to the horizon from cobalt blue through cadmium orange to alizarin crimson. Monet's series on the Grand Canal has been compared compositionally by Joachim Pissarro to the beach at Juan-les-Pins from his Antibes excursion of 1888, with the dancing pines as a parallel to the vertical poles foregrounding the distant Basilica di Santa Maria della Salute. However, the series with which Monet is arguably most strongly associated, and which pushed the boundaries of painterly technique in terms of composition, palette, and painted surface, was that of the water lilies from the Lily Pond at Giverny. The paintings are remarkable, firstly, in focusing exclusively on the water lilies and the water surface, referencing anything external to this, such as trees or the sky, only through their reflection in the water. But secondly, Monet's facture, on large-scale canvases, using layered colours and using broad and loose brush gestures, is remarkably lyrical. Of the nearly 250 canvases Monet made featuring water lilies, perhaps his most significant is the series of wide canvases with a specially designed oval room to house them in the Orangerie in Paris, the works of which Monet referred to as La Décoration. Painted within earshot of the shelling of the trenches, and dedicated to the ideal of peace after the First World War, they together form huge panoramic views which immerse the viewer in the world that Monet had created with his garden and his art, a world of natural beauty through water and light and, above all, colour.